Classical Sanskrit drama. I'm going to try to give you a very, very basic introduction, partly because trying to give you a fuller picture than just a very basic introduction would take a lot more time than we've actually got. We're talking about 1,000 years, probably, of compositions. That's going to involve a whole lot of people, a whole lot of geography, a whole lot of history, a whole lot of all sorts of things that we just can't cover. So a very, very, very introductory glance at classical Sanskrit drama. Now that 1,000-year period also presents us with some problems because there's an awful lot of things going on in that big block of time, but there's an awful lot of, what should we say, hazy areas. We have very little certain knowledge when it comes to classical Sanskrit drama of dates. It's very hard to pinpoint when things might have been written or when certain authors might have lived. So we have to talk in kind of big chunks of time, bigger maybe than we're used to. We talk in spans of a few centuries when we're trying to date things that are related to classical Sanskrit drama, and it's just because that's about the best we can do. So I'll be talking in some very general ways in this very basic introduction. We also have some haziness about authorship. I mean, usually the plays that we'll talk about have authors attributed to them, but those attributions are sometimes a little suspect. So we talk about authorship. So a playwright wrote such and such a play, and we just kind of take it as given that maybe so-and-so didn't, or maybe so-and-so was never actually a real person. Authorship's maybe not so important as we might think. Now, where does classical Sanskrit drama begin? Probably, the very first step, we have to start talking vaguely, probably in the 1st century CE. Now, some folks would date this a little earlier. I mean, you might push some classical Sanskrit drama a little bit into maybe the 1st or 2nd century BCE, but I think 1st century CE is a good place to start. And in fact, we don't start with complete dramas, just fully realized, dropped in our laps in a whole bunch of pages. The very first classical Sanskrit drama that we've got is really just fragments. Not full plays, but little bits of plays. We first get complete plays probably from the 2nd century, and smaller plays at the very beginning of the tradition, and then it seems that big, expansive, epic dramas come in the next couple of centuries and carry the tradition towards the 9th, 10th, maybe the 11th century, when the tradition kind of peters out. Classical Sanskrit drama has some conventions. Conventions that today we would recognize as dramatic. We've got characters acting out stories, and the stories seem to be built on cause and effect relationships. The characters are believable. But we should probably put this word believable in some air quotes, if that doesn't drive you completely mad, because believability here does not mean realistic or naturalistic, as we use the stylistic term in the study of Western drama. Encountering a classical Sanskrit drama, you would not look at the characters and say, oh, he or she looks just like my neighbor and does things and says things exactly in the way that my boss at work does things and says things. The characters aren't believable in that way. The characters are believable in the sense that they manifest consistency with the world of the play itself. We don't encounter in classical Sanskrit drama characters who seem to disrupt arbitrarily what's going on in the play. And for that matter, we do in fact encounter characters who give a recognizable or a familiar air of humanity. At least on paper, and this is a problem we'll come back to in a second. As we read classical Sanskrit drama, as we read what characters say, it's easy to recognize elements of humanity. Legitimate, we might say realistic humanity in these characters. They're believable in that way. Now the narratives are similar, right? They're believable in the internal world that the plays give you. And the stories do build on cause and effect. Well, maybe I shouldn't even introduce this cause and effect phrase. I mean, this is an Aristotelian phrase, cause and effect, right? Your story, if you're writing a drama, says Aristotle has got to proceed very strictly on premises of cause and effect. Something happens, and that causes the next thing to happen, which causes the next thing to happen. I don't want to make any move to tie classical Sanskrit drama to Aristotle. Classical Sanskrit drama works in a very different way than Aristotelian drama works. But at the level of story, again, the kind of storytelling that we encounter on paper in classical Sanskrit drama has a familiarity to it. If we have any familiarity with drama, even movies at all, the way that the stories are told does have a kind of linearity to it. That is, things kind of proceed along a timeline that goes from past to future. We'll look at this also a little bit later. Because even though what seems to be the linearity of the story feels very familiar to us, the stories turn out to be much more circular in the way they're constructed than Aristotle would have been happy with. And that's fine. Who made Aristotle the king of drama anyway? All right, so what else do we need to say as an introduction to classical Sanskrit drama? The stories concern kings and gods and political intrigue and wars and love and death, kind of things that, even if we don't encounter ourselves war directly, we've got some familiarity with. Encountering gods directly, that's probably a little bit more unfamiliar territory. But the kinds of stories that classical Sanskrit drama is giving us very much in concert with the kinds of stories that Greek drama gives us, and I was just going to say Roman drama, but that's a problematic term. What we get from Shakespeare and Moliere and even Arthur Miller, Eugene O'Neill, those kinds of stories are very much, they mesh with the way the classical Sanskrit drama stories look on paper. Keep that in mind. I keep coming back to this paper thing, and it's kind of important because these are dramas. Now, in the study of theater in the West, the word drama really refers to literature. That is, plays as they appear written on paper. And this is a really important distinction for classical Sanskrit drama because in the same way that it's very hard for us to figure out exactly where things are supposed to fall historically, we have a very, very hard time trying to figure out exactly how these classical Sanskrit dramas were performed. Where the characters that we encounter on paper, the way that they speak, the kinds of things that they want, the kinds of things that they do, feels very familiar to us. It might very well be that stylistically, actually in a theater, watching the actors work out this script could have been very, very strange. Forms like Kudiyatam and Kathakali that are descendants of classical Sanskrit drama give you some indication of what I mean. In performance classical Sanskrit drama, the characters, the stories, the whole thing might have seemed very much not familiar. Not familiar to day-to-day life in your house and on the street. Nevertheless, what we've got is paper, and so we'll move ahead with it as best we can. In a future lecture, we'll talk about the Nautica, which gives us maybe some indication of what's going on stages, but even that's a little problematic to reconcile the Nautica with plays that we actually have. Now, there are two types of classical Sanskrit drama. Actually, there are quite a few more than this, but there are two major types. Two, might say, big baskets into which the dramas that we have might fall. First big category that we might talk about is Nautica. Second big category is the Procrit plays. And then there's an assortment of other kinds of plays that are of varying lengths and structures and so forth. They've got their own characteristics. But the two big ones, Nautica on one hand, Procrit on the other hand. Now, Nautica are sometimes called the history plays, but that was probably not the best way to talk about them. The Nautica plays are the ones that are about things that are serious, but not serious in a grim sort of way. They're serious in the sense that they concern matters of cosmic import. Things on which existence really depends. That's what Nautica concerns, right? So who are the main characters in Nautica plays? Well, they're the people, the creatures on which existence really depends. So in Nautica plays, we encounter kings, because obviously everything depends on kings. We encounter gods, or various types of divine beings in Nautica plays, because, without them, existence kind of falls apart. And the kinds of stories that Nautica concerns are serious in the sense that what happens in a Nautica play tends to be concerned with whether or not cosmic order is going to hang together the way that it's supposed to. Now, there's an interesting twist on this, because as we'll talk about in a minute, cosmic order just ain't going to fall apart. And this is one of the things that classical Sanskrit drama characters discover. Nevertheless, while we're figuring that out, there's some considerable tension in Nautica plays. Now, the other main sort of classical Sanskrit drama is Procrit plays. Now, these are what we might call comedies. They're not so serious, but they're also not farces either. I mean, this is not, the Marx Brothers or the Three Stooges or even Three Idiots. These plays are not serious in the sense that they concern things that aren't really gonna throw the entire cosmic order into confusion. So in the Procrit plays, what kind of characters would you have? You just have regular folks who can, appear in the cosmic order and disappear without really creating a ripple. Kings can't do that, the gods can't do that, but, shopkeepers and mid-level priests and farmers and fishermen and courtesans of various sorts and, regular folks. What we might call the middle class, right? These are middle class dramas, maybe. And, the stories that these kinds of not so significant characters get caught up in concern conflicts on which the entire cosmic order does not hang. So what would that be? These are family fortunes, individual family fortunes. We're not talking about, the king's financial holdings upon which the whole country and everything else depends. One family, what do they got in the bank? Very worried about this. That's a Procrit topic. Feuds between families over some, long past slight between the two families. Infatuations between regular folks, mistaken identities and taxes and all that stuff. That is the matter of the Procrit plays. So on the one hand, Nautica, very serious stuff. Not that it's just grim and ugly, but because everything hangs on it. The Procrit plays, which are fun, partly because, whatever happens is not really going to affect anything in the long run. And the other plays of sort of smaller stature have a kind of mixture of the elements of these two big categories. Now, let's get back to this matter of literature. Again, we've got these plays on paper. We've got maybe no really good evidence of how they might have been performed. And so we have to treat them as historical artifacts. We have to treat them as literature. We read them. And we can speculate how they might have been played on a stage. But it seems also that the authors of these plays had literature in mind when they wrote them. These are very poetic compositions. They're written in verse, not, the rhyming kind of verse that we get out of Moliere or something like that, but verse in the sense of being metrically structured, governed by conventions of how long a line is going to be, what the particular rhythm in a line is going to be. And the poetic quality of the plays tends to love wandering off into very long poetic detours. Now this is the kind of thing that Aristotle would freak out about, right? Stick to the story, tell me the story. If what you're giving me isn't part of the story, forget it, throw it away. But the classical Sanskrit dramatists, they don't really care what Aristotle has to say about things. And thank goodness, because they give us some really great poetry when they just start, the poets, when they just start looking around at what might be in the character's world. Sometimes it seems like the authors get so easily distracted. You got a couple of characters and they're talking to each other, and then all of a sudden one of them starts looking at the trees. The next thing you know, you've gone on for a page and a half about how beautiful the trees are, how green the leaves are, and the dew on the branches, and you get creepers going up the trunk, and it goes on and on and on. The poetry is lovely rhythmically. The poets really had something here. And unlike Aristotle, the poets appreciated that the sound of the verse was worthwhile. Worthwhile enough to keep, even if it doesn't advance the story in some kind of maudlin, mundane way. They even tend to get off on these tangents when they're talking about people. I mean, nature is really, really important for these plays. Nature always seems to be the thing that distracts them. They go off talking about the sky and the mountains and the moon and the forest and blah, blah, blah. But even when characters start talking about people, they tend to wander off into these long poetic descriptions of people that are very much couched in natural language. These long descriptions of characters, other characters that might not be on stage at the moment, wander off into these great descriptions of people and the manner of trees and creepers and having, dew on their limbs and the way that the light hits them, the way light hits flowers and there's something about the natural world that really captured the imagination of the classical Sanskrit dramatists. They just seem not to be able to satisfy themselves in the effort to describe it poetically, nature. Even when they have to talk about people, it just has to be a natural sort of thing. Now, the other thing that's really important about the literary nature of classical Sanskrit drama is wrapped up in the very name of classical Sanskrit drama. The plays are Sanskrit dramas, and Sanskrit's a really literary language at this point. It's the kind of thing that that poets write in, but it's not the kind of thing that people really carry conversations in. So this is also to indicate that the authors of these plays had literature in mind when they wrote the plays, and they probably had performance in mind as well, but they were certainly writing not only for performance. The authors of the Sanskrit plays, in the poetic Sanskrit that they adopted, were clearly writing also for people to read these plays. On the other hand, and this is one of the really funny things about classical Sanskrit drama, there's a lot less Sanskrit in a classical Sanskrit drama than you would expect, given the fact that it's called Sanskrit drama. And why is this? Well, there's some good speculations as to why it might be, based on what actually happens in the absence of Sanskrit. So, Sanskrit's not the only language that we encounter in these plays. We do encounter Sanskrit, but only spoken in the mouths of certain characters. You have to be kind of, shall we say, important to speak Sanskrit in the classical Sanskrit play. And there's plenty of important characters. The kings and the gods, of course, are going to speak Sanskrit. Not a lot of other people are. You might have some very high-level priests who speak Sanskrit. Although, there's a peculiar convention that shows up in a lot of the Sanskrit plays in which you have a sort of low, mid-level priest who pretends to speak Sanskrit and doesn't ever quite get it right. He's there for comic effect, and it's effective. Mostly what you get in those characters who can speak Sanskrit are men, the important men. Kings are always going to be men, obviously. The divine figure is not always necessarily going to be male, but those that speak Sanskrit generally will be. And there are just a few exceptions where we find women who speak Sanskrit. That is, just a handful, very small, a limited number of religious figures who are women who get to speak Sanskrit in classical Sanskrit drama, what we might call nuns, although that's not really a term that ports into classical Sanskrit drama. And some courtesans get to speak Sanskrit. And this is speculative again, but you might be able to figure out a good reason why the courtesans would be speaking Sanskrit, because they've got to be trained to hang out with the important men. So of course they have to learn some Sanskrit. Now, what is everybody else going to be speaking? Well, everybody else is speaking some type of what's called Procrit. There are a number of these, but these are the vernacular languages of the day. The languages that people are actually speaking on the street. Even, if you happen to be standing out on a classical Sanskrit street, I don't know where that would be, but you're standing out there on the street corner and the king comes along and another king comes along and they have a conversation out there in the real world that you're inhabiting. You're not going to hear them actually speaking to each other in classical Sanskrit drama. It's too complex and poetic. In the same way that, if you're hanging out in Elizabethan London, you're not going to see Queen Elizabeth and one of her major courtiers speaking in iambic pentameter, rhymed besides. That's just not the way conversations are carried on. What's actually spoken day to day in the streets, in the shops, in the fields, in the forests. These are variations on Procrit, and the dramas are smart enough to know that the character, that the language is going to be more natural. Procrit, one Procrit or another is going to be more natural in the mouths of folks who would be speaking Procrit out in the real world than to try to force some kind of Sanskrit into their mouths. Now, kings and gods, that's an exception because they're supposed to be a little bit grander than everybody else anyway. And putting Sanskrit in their mouths helps to elevate them. So those regular folks that we enumerated, some of those that show up in the Prakarnas, the policemen, the low-level courtiers, and the fishermen, and the gardeners, and people who wash clothes, and they're all speaking one kind of Procrit or another, one kind of vernacular language on the stage, where the really important people get to speak Sanskrit. So think about this. This is kind of an interesting situation, and it lends itself to some speculation about what might be going on in performance in the classical Sanskrit day. Imagine you go to a play today. Somebody gives you tickets or whatever it is you do. And when you decide you're going to go to a play, somebody gives you tickets, you go to the play, you sit down, and what happens on the stage in front of you is something like 3 or 4 of the characters are speaking Latin, highly poetic, literary Latin. And some of the other characters are speaking Italian. And they make up the king's court, perhaps. And then there's some people outside the court who come in and out, maybe the police chief of the city or something like that. And that group of people are speaking Spanish. And then there's another group, regular folks in the village, shopkeepers and so forth, and they're speaking Romanian. And then there's this one sort of mid-level priest who keeps coming in and out and in and out, and he's pretending to speak Latin, but his Latin's all screwed up, and it's mostly gibberish. This is what seems to be going on in the classical Sanskrit drama. This is what's indicated as happening in performance in an actual theater in, say, 4th century CE. And this lends itself to some speculation as to what that theater might have looked like. Not necessarily the physical structure, but who's attending this performance. The fact that all these languages are showing up on the stage together suggests that we've got a mixed audience, an audience of various classes, we might say, various social standing, probably men and women together. And all of those folks, even though they don't have access to high-level literary Sanskrit, they all have access to the play because there's all these different languages going on. It's an interesting circumstance. I don't know of any other dramatic literature that quite approaches the use of language in performance in quite the same way. So let's leave that there. Another discussion a little bit later, we'll talk about some specific playwrights, we'll talk about some specific plays, and we'll talk about the Nautica, which gives us some, what we might call theory, about how classical Sanskrit dramas might have been done, and some interesting theory about what the aesthetic effects of classical Sanskrit might have been.